who's a professor of history at the University of Virginia, where he teaches history of colonial America and the history of cartography. He leads two digital projects, Map Scholar and Visualize, both platforms for geospatial visualization in the humanities. He also co-directs the UVA Early American Seminar in Monticello, a research community for faculty and graduate students in Charlotte. His first book was Plantation Enterprise in Colonial South Carolina, which describes how planters and slaves adapted to the volatile environments in the Carolina Lowcountry. His latest book, and the focus of tonight's presentation, is The New Map of Empire, How Britain Imagined America Before Independence. It was awarded the 2017 John Lyman Book Award in the U.S. Maritime History, and was a finalist for the 2018 George Washington Book Prize. Thank you, Scott. Max.
Thanks for having me, Andrew, Steve, and everyone else at the Map Society. I'm really delighted to be here. And so what I'm going to show you today is kind of a greatest hits presentation of maps that I discuss in my book. So the book is called The New Map of Empire. All of the maps featured in the book are featured for free online. So if you go to mapscholar.org/empire, which is right at the bottom there, you can see all 257 maps and map collections that I analyze in the book. If you're interested, please buy the book. If you're not quite that interested, please look at the website, which is available.
Is your book on Amazon?
It is. It's Harvard University Press 2017. So, but before I start showing you some of the maps, what I'd like to do is to not only talk about the cartography, but talk about the history that I think it reveals. And so when I undertook this research, my focus was really on understanding that turbulent generation before the American Revolution. And so I'd like to put some of these maps in a broader frame that helps explain the history of the American Revolution. So to start off with, I think one of the most common words in this era is this idea of independence. It's the idea in the first paragraph of the Declaration of Independence that the U.S. dissolved the political bands that bound it to the British Crown. For most of us, it's the second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence that really matters. It gives meaning to the idea of independence, that all men are created equal, that they have unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This is the idea of personal independence, that we as human beings are free, independent agents, and our government has to respect the rights that we have to be left alone and to govern ourselves. But I think what my book unearths is a third meaning of independence, and that's the one I'd like to talk about now and throughout my talk tonight as I show you these maps. That's the idea of geographic independence, and it opens up what I think is a kind of darker perspective of the American Revolution. In the era, American geographic independence meant that the United States could grow, that it could expand across the continent without limitation. It meant that farmers, planters, and settlers would gain unimpeded access to new lands in the West, and above all, it meant that the colonies that these settlers belonged to were societies that could dream of becoming empires in miniature, each engaging in bold new ventures of expansion, with dreams of amassing wealth, becoming more refined, sophisticated, and great. So beneath the high rhetoric of revolutionaries' writings about liberty and tyranny, there lurked this vision of colonizing an expansive continent. This is the heart of one of the motivations behind the American Revolution these maps help us see. This geographic vision for America infused the revolutionary moment with passion for a wished-for future, this glorious idea of a continental empire. It also references the opposite of this idea of geographic independence, a fear on the part of colonists that Britain was trying to enforce a kind of geographic dependence on the colonies. In the years before the fight for American political independence, British writers and officials wanted to tighten their control over North American colonies and take control over the new territories that Britain had acquired in the New World with a firmer hand. So this was a fraught generation in which Britain sent out surveyors, and they drew a remarkable collection of new maps. These maps, I think the best way way to read them, and the way I'll read them tonight, is that they express this idea of a newly dependent and controlled colonial America. It made that dream of control palpable. So when American colonists looked at British maps of empire, like the ones I'm going to show you today, they saw the outlines of this great nation that they dreamed of, restricted, confined, obscured. In 1776, they sought to do away with these images and draw their own maps. So I think that's the big frame that I wanted to kind of lay out tonight before we look at the maps. But I also wanted to talk to you a little bit about how I got interested in map history. I began my research into the history of cartography by exploring the collections of the Library of Congress, the largest map library in the world. It has over 5 million maps, plans, and charts in its vaults. If you haven't been, I would certainly encourage you to go and sift through some of these amazing images. When I started my research, I didn't know that much about map history, and I expected that most of the maps I would look at of the colonial period would be maps of places like Massachusetts, Philadelphia, Virginia, places that were the center of wealth and population in early America. Instead, and there certainly were some maps of these places, but I found map after map of places like the frigid shores of Nova Scotia. And let me tell you, once you've seen your first map of the coastlines of Nova Scotia, by the 20th, you kind of get the picture. But there's a lot of maps of Nova Scotia in the Library of Congress. There are also maps of places I'd never really heard of, like the tropical island of Dominica, lots of high-resolution maps of the swampy lands along the Mississippi River. British surveyors created these maps to help plan an ambitious array of new British colonies. Colonies that were going to be regulated, limited, subordinated to the interests of the mother country in the ways that the colonies on the seaboard sometimes weren't. As these new colonial ventures started collapsing, largely under the weight of unrealistic expectations for developing these places, and also in the chaos of the violence of the Revolutionary War, all these carefully drawn planning documents, the maps I'm going to show you today, were scattered around the world. They stopped being planning documents. They became instead historical artifacts. They ended up, a lot of them at the Library of Congress, the National Archives of the United Kingdom probably has the largest collection, British Library. I visited the UK Hydrographic Office and the UK Admiralty Library at Portsmouth, and many other archives in the US and the UK. And I've worked for the better part of the last decade to try to reassemble this visual record of what was intended to be a new and improved version of British America. And I guess I lost count a little bit, but in my map bibliography database, I think I had 2,500 entries of maps that I consulted to do this work. So the book curates a sample of those that I think is representative. 257 individual maps and map collections, most of them manuscript maps, some of them published, some of them in the great atlases from the London publishing firms. And these maps, all of them are available online for you to look at, some of which I'll show you tonight, illustrate the story of how Great Britain attempted to take command of America in this generation before the American Revolution. But instead of doing what they were intended to do, instead of putting this empire on a sound and rational foundation, this new British colonial plan provoked American colonists. It played to their darkest conspiratorial fears of what the future held within the British Empire, and it strengthened their resolve to seek geographic as well as political independence. So how well did Great Britain know America before the Revolution? The short answer is British officials and surveyors and map producers knew America very, very well in a few critical places, but not very well at all in general. So to answer this question, let's take a look at a popular, overstuffed atlas that brought much of this official British knowledge of America together between two covers. Mapmaker Thomas Jeffries, the most prolific mapmaker of this era, published what he called the General Topography of North America and the West Indies in 1768. So if you were a wealthy British person and you had 6 guineas to spare, in today's money that might be around $1,000, you could walk into a Fleet Street map shop and stagger out with a personal copy of this massive volume. And the Library of Congress has several copies of these, and the whole atlas is online at the Library of Congress's website. The visualization you see before you shows the bounding boxes for each of the 93 individual maps that this atlas contains. So on the face of it, this coverage seems pretty comprehensive. The general topography was, in many ways, a visual record of Britain's victories in what historians now refer to as the 7 Years' War. In North America, it was often called the French and Indian War. The great conflict between France and Britain over who would control North America. And because it was a record of these war sites, a lot of people bought this atlas as a kind of patriotic artifact, as they were still celebrating this victory that was concluded in 1763. By flipping through these maps, sometimes with a text of events during this war, they could relive the drama of this world-shaking conflict in which Great Britain was a great victor. This was a great global war for empire. It pitted Great Britain against its rivals, France and Spain. It raged from 1756 to 1763. And in North America, the war really boiled down to a conflict between Britain and France over who would control the continent. So Thomas Jeffreys was officially geographer to the king. That was his official title. And it didn't come with much money, but it came with a special permission to get access to all of the manuscript maps that British Army surveyors were sending back from America. And many of the maps that ended up in the general topography were maps that he engraved based on those original manuscripts. He begins his atlas, like many atlases begin, with a broadly framed view. This was a map that Jeffreys copied. Some uncharitable people might say he plagiarized it. The original is by John Green. It's a huge 6-sheet chart of North and South America. It's an image that not only showed British knowledge of this hemisphere, but it proclaimed Britain's central place in the Western Hemisphere, right at the heart of it. And if we zoom in to the central panel on this map, you'll see that Thomas Jeffreys, if you can tell, there's a little shadow around this. This is a paper overleaf that's actually pasted into the atlas. And there are 2 of these overleafs. And with them, you can see the changing boundaries of North America during the course of the 7 Years' War. So this first map, which is titled Claims of the French in 1756, you see this threatening yellow expanse across the continent. That was France's claims in the New World. This was the specter of French influence at the heart of the continent was something that menaced the colonists and threatened them as the war began. The second panel, if you folded that one back, shows a green neutral zone that was part of a French peace plan that was proposed in 1761. The idea here was that the area that the forces were really fighting over, the Ohio River Valley in the center of the continent, would be declared a kind of green neutral zone, kind of off limits to everyone, a demilitarized zone. But by the time the war had gotten to this point, and Britain was starting to win some of these engagements and battles, the war hawks in Whitehall were not having any of it. They didn't want a peace plan. They wanted total victory over the French. And if you fold back this plate, you see the engraved surface of the map that appeared in this atlas. There is no sign of the French presence in North America. The French had been evicted from North America after the peace of 1763, and the real surface of the map, the way nature intended it, is the way you would see it if you were a patriotic British person in this era, was that it was a fully British place, totally marked out for British grandeur. So those paper leaves were history. You could peel them off and throw them away and see the true configuration of the continent with absolute British sovereignty, the French nowhere to be seen. Britain's great victories over these imperial rivals on land and sea enabled the crown to claim all of North America as well as new islands in the Caribbean as the Treaty of Paris was settled in 1763. But beneath this image of total control, total supremacy, other maps in Jeffreys' atlas show the limits of this geographic knowledge. So here's our index map again. And again, it looks like they've got a lot of maps of a lot of places. But if we pick out the maps that show the really high resolution knowledge at the core of this atlas, places where British military engineers mapped out routes and important strategic sites, we can see how this knowledge was incredibly sharp in some places and that the rest of the map was kind of an unknown. So if we zoom in on some of these images, the general topography includes lots of specific battle images and military images, scores of maps of strategic sites, vital routes that were used by armed forces during the conduct of the war. Among them are maps that were originally seized from the French and repurposed to plan the invasion once it was won in 1759, turned the tide of the war in favor of Great Britain. If we zoom out again to this route and sites overview, we can see some other places like the site of Fort Duquesne, really the place that the war began, that was later named Fort Pitt and became the site of modern-day Pittsburgh. Fort Duquesne, this was the original that this published map was based on, was originally drafted by a Virginia military officer. During the course of the conflict, he was held as a hostage in Fort Duquesne by the French. They unwisely gave him his freedom to roam around the grounds of the fort, and he secretly sketched it. And when a friendly Indian was visiting Fort Duquesne, he smuggled this sketch out with this Indian, who returned it to British officials. They made other sketch maps. They sent it back to London. Thomas Jeffries got his hands on it, and so that's how this map entered the atlas. The other thing that really surprised me about this atlas was that not only were there tons of maps of places I knew about from the history of the 7 Years' War, Fort Duquesne, Quebec, upstate New York, but tons of maps of the Caribbean as well. There are 11 maps of Cuban port towns that British merchants hoped after the war would be places they could flood with British goods and take advantage of legally or illegally. So from Cape Antonio on the west side of Cuba, all the way to these isolated ports on the east side of the island, like the port of Baracoa, this was a space that the war promised would be part of the rewards of the great victory. British merchants could suddenly invade these Spanish markets. So those who turn the pages of this great atlas could see many of these places in incredible detail, in high resolution. But what this index map exposes to me is how much space remained unsurveyed, how much remained unmapped, even in this great compilation. All the new territories that Britain claimed after the Peace of 1763, they did not have good geographic knowledge of them. So when we look at them from this perspective, despite all the vibrant maps that Thomas Jeffries gathered together in this atlas, the new territories that were going to be developed into new colonies were, in practical terms, really an unknown space. So there's another map that people could buy in 1763 as a kind of patriotic artifact. They were celebrating Britain's victory in the 7 Years' War. In 1763, in celebration of the Peace of Paris, another prolific mapmaker, Emmanuel Bowen, pictured the new extent of Britain's Western Empire. He published this accurate map of North America, and it showed British holdings stretching from Hudson Bay in the north all the way down to the Florida Keys, from the Atlantic coast all the way to the Mississippi River, and across new islands in the West Indies. So to better rule this huge new empire, Britain sent out new surveyors to map out all those blank spaces that they didn't know much about. And they wanted to map them to new standards with a great deal more rigor and precision than they had before. It was one thing to map a few routes and sites during wartime. It was another to map things out comprehensively so they could be cultivated as colonies. Great Britain oversaw its huge empire through a small office in the Treasury Building in Whitehall. A committee called the Lords Commissioners of Trade and Plantations, everyone just called them the Board of Trade, managed information that flowed from this empire to London. They created policy for the overseas colonies. And this control of information gave them a lot of influence and power, especially after the wars were concluded. Now that Britain had gained all this new territory, King George III commanded the Board of Trade to provide a plan for how these new lands that Britain had won could be transformed into new and valuable colonies. So the Board of Trade wrote a report. There are a lot of reports that the British government wrote in this era. This one was called the Report on Acquisitions in America. And in order to make clear the new boundaries of the colonies that it was defining, so that the king could really see them, they bought not only a copy of this map, they bought this copy of this map. And they brought it back to Whitehall, and they hand-colored and annotated the map, and they included it with their report. And this is what the king and his counselors saw when they were putting together the plan for empire. This particular edition of Bowen's accurate map of North America. So they did this by hand. They used lines and colors to make clear their vision for this new imperial world. And the leading idea behind it was that British America should be reshaped and reformed to keep all the British subjects as close as possible to the Atlantic Ocean, close to Atlantic commerce, close to centers of law and order and government. When France had ruled Canada, New France was this vast, sprawling colony that spanned not only the settlements along the St. Lawrence, but all the way to the Great Lakes. The Board of Trade wanted the new British colony that took its place, the colony of Quebec, to occupy a much smaller footprint. And so these are the boundaries the Board of Trade proposed, basically the watersheds of rivers that flowed into the St. Lawrence. So colonists there could be more regulated and controlled. Spanish Florida, too, had once been a sprawling province that took up the entirety of the North American southeast. But under the Board of Trade's hand, the new colonies it defined, East and West Florida, were much more compact, much closer to the ocean, the peninsular colony of East Florida and the Gulf Coast colony of West Florida. And all the way down to the southeastern Caribbean, there were new colonies that they just painted in a few brushstrokes that I've highlighted here. By taking possession of Dominica, St. Vincent, Grenada, and Tobago, so-called ceded islands, because they were ceded in the peace to Britain in the peace of 1763, Britain now controlled most of the Lesser Antilles, most of the sea lanes by which almost all shipping entered the Caribbean Sea. These islands not only offered a strategic place for commerce and naval activity, they promised new lands for slavery and sugar cultivation. And some of you may have heard of some of that, but I'm sure most of you have heard of the most decisive thing that the Board of Trade drew on this map. That is a red line down the mountains. This is the very first iteration of what you probably learned in school as the proclamation line. So this red line down the mountains was meant to impose a limit to settler expansion in North America. The king took the Board of Trade's recommendation and he drafted what's known as the Proclamation of 1763. This gave the board's plan real legal authority in the empire. The king took the board's line that was drawn across this map and made it into what we now see as the proclamation line. It basically ordered colonial governors not to grant any new lands beyond this line or in any other place where Native Americans could claim land as their own. So taken together, this map, this Board of Trade annotated map, expressed this new controlled vision of America, a place that should be more orderly, more stable than the volatile world that Britain actually took possession of in 1763. One of the challenges of the Peace of 1763 was that it set the boundaries of British North America at the Mississippi River. And some of you who remember your American history from this era will know there was a complicated swap of territories between the major powers to make this deal happen. As part of the peace agreement, France agreed to leave North America, but Spain would only agree to give up Florida if it could inherit the former French colony of Louisiana. So this swap of territories was really strategic on the part of the Spanish. They hoped that if they had possession of Louisiana, this would kind of keep the British at bay a little bit in North America, keep them apart from the rest of Spanish America. But it also meant that the Spanish now were in possession of New Orleans, and that the British, to make all of that new territory along the Mississippi River valuable as plantation land, would have to find an alternate route from the Gulf of Mexico to the Mississippi River that didn't pass under the guns of Spanish New Orleans. So when the peace negotiators were in Paris and trying to figure this out, they looked at all the best maps published in Paris that would give them an idea of this place. And we don't exactly know which maps they used, but really any map published in Paris around the 1760s would have shown a clear water route from the Mississippi River that bypassed New Orleans. And I'll highlight that on this Danville map. So the idea here was that instead of going down the Mississippi River, in fact, this red pointer is not going to show up. You see where New Orleans is in the typical course of the Mississippi River, just under that blue line. The blue line outlines what the peace negotiators thought they could achieve by setting the boundary where they did. Boats could go from the Gulf of Mexico. They entered a passage called the Rigolets. They crossed these great lakes, Lake Pontchartrain, Lake Maurepas, and they could proceed along the Iberville River all the way to the banks of the Mississippi. So this was a key piece of geographic knowledge on which the whole development of British West Florida rested. This appeared on every single map they could have looked at as an open and obstructed waterway that would perfectly serve the purposes of colonization they had in mind. In reality, it turned out to be little more than a shallow stream. It was so narrow, in fact, that when the first British boatmen went up the Iberville River, the trees on either side of the Iberville were so close together that they formed an interlocking canopy above them. And the boatmen had actually striped the masts of the boat to get through, not what they were expecting at all. And the first Army engineers to go down this route made a manuscript map of it. This is a manuscript map by Army Lieutenant Philip Pittman. He tried to reach the Mississippi along this Iberville River route in 1765. He sounded the channel and marked its depth with small numbers in ink. He switched from black-colored fathoms to red-colored feet as the passage became more and more shallow. At 6 miles out from the Mississippi, he declared only 2 feet of clearance. You can see the black numbers turning to red here as he enters the Iberville River. And he had to leave his flatboat along the banks. And his party, which was ordered to go find the Mississippi River so that the British could plant a fort there, they had to leave their flatboat and make their way to the river through the muddy banks on foot. Pittman wrote that this passage was so choked up by wood that the soldiers later had to be detailed from Pensacola. The British hired 50 slaves from their masters in Louisiana. This should resolve itself in just a minute. And they spent months clearing this passage, hoping it could be used as a corridor into this new valuable land in the colony of West Florida, and so that the British could build its new fort to take possession of it along the Mississippi River. Within a year, however, even after all of this labor, the Iberville River immediately clogged up again, making the whole thing almost impossible to reach. Another surveyor visited this site, a man named Harry Gordon. He gave a pretty unvarnished opinion of the situation. He said, "The free navigation of the Mississippi is a joke." He thought that no vessel will come to the Iberville from the sea. And he blamed the British peace negotiations. These fools in London who had believed what they saw on these old maps, thinking that the stream was going to be navigable. And in his view, this error turned what could have been a really valuable colony into useless land, cut off from any safe path to the Gulf of Mexico. And there were a lot of schemes that the British hatched to try to solve this problem. I think one of the most interesting is this idea. And here you see the fort that they did build and then quickly abandoned on the edge. There's the proposed ditch on the right. The idea was if you dug a ditch from the Mississippi, all that strong Mississippi water would come in and just flush out the Iberville so boats could reach there. They tried this again and again, but it was just not going to work. They really didn't have the means of making this a viable place of settlement. After the American Revolution, Britain retroceded West Florida back to Spain, in part because it never was a successful British colony. The Board of Trade drew a red line through the mountains on Emmanuel Bowen's map of North America. They hoped that this act of geographic division would help promote peace on what had been an incredibly violent Indian frontier. The prospect of a proclamation line was an opportunity to imagine a different and better version of American history. Instead of driving Native Americans off their lands, colonial governments might have negotiated a settlement in which they agreed to keep colonists east of the mountains, and Native Americans could be formed into new nations that would be subordinate to the King of Britain, but would have their own autonomy. This rare manuscript map, maybe the only map that survives that pictures what this world that never materialized, this world of peace between settlers and Indians, might have looked like. After the British Superintendent for Indian Affairs, a man named John Stuart, met with tribes of the southern nations, he drew this map and he sent it back to London in 1764. And I kind of imagine what the clerks at the Board of Trade saw when they unrolled this map and saw the first map that actually saw native nations as real republics with their own boundaries. And to highlight these, I'll show you what I'm talking about. So there was a place on this map for the Chickasaw Indians, for the Choctaw Indians, for the Cherokee Nation, and for the huge Creek Nation in this new map of empire that Stuart sent back to his superiors. It showed native nations living side by side with British colonies, filling up the King's Dominion in North America. And the way, former French enemies, Native Americans, were now considered new subjects of the king. They had rights that Britain was bound to respect by the terms of the treaty. Each of these Indian nations had a new space on this map that promised that their rights as subjects of the king would be respected. Despite this vision of peaceful coexistence, the forces driving settlement in the continental interior were just too powerful, and Native Americans were just too few to resist it forever. As historian Patrick Griffin puts it, even as the proclamation of 1763 was being proclaimed, speculators sought to claim lands west of the mountains, forming companies, dispatching surveyors, as if the proclamation line did not exist. In an important sense, however, such a line didn't really exist at all, except as this shape drawn across the surface of some paper maps. One of the reasons that this vision of Anglo-Indian peace failed was that no one could locate this abstract boundary in the real spaces of eastern North America. And this will come as no surprise to some of you who've done a little hiking or traveling through the Appalachian Mountains. The Board of Trade's red line across Bowen's map was trying to separate rivers. It tried to put all the rivers that flowed into the Atlantic on the east side of the line and all the rivers that flowed into the Gulf of Mexico through the Mississippi on the west side of that line. And this map seemed authoritative. It was really one of the best, most detailed, most respected maps of its era, but no one had actually gone into this interior and surveyed this land. These shapes representing mountains, and if you look closely on them, they're just the same little mountain with its own little foothill, just repeated again and again across the map. This was Emmanuel Bowen filling up the space on his map, but British policymakers took it seriously and thought by drawing this line they could actually create a real division between colonists and Indians, but they were really drawing a line across what amounted to a terra incognita. No one had provided the surveys that could support such a line. And if you remember your history books from high school, you probably saw a version of this map. This is the most popular map of the proclamation line. It was created by John Gibson. It was published in the October 1763 issue of the Gentleman's Magazine. This is a magazine kind of like the New Yorker. Many educated British people subscribed to it. It talked about history, politics, literature, current events. And this was the map that I think most Britons and most high school students today see when they're taught about the proclamation line. And we look at this line, it's even more unrealistic. The Appalachian Mountains are compressed into a single ridge line where it's easy to draw a map. And in bold letters across the interior, it says land reserved for the Indians. As I live very close to the Appalachian Mountains, and I know for a fact that it's not so simple. In fact, geologists call these mountains a cordillera, kind of because it resembles a vast braided rope in its complex formations. These mountains sprawl across hundreds of miles. There are valleys, plateaus, foothills. No colonial map could make sense of such geographic complexity. Yeah?
So this may be 20/20 hindsight, but how can, if it's, was it not apparent to the people who were reading those maps that the author was filling the lines in, and if they'd never done a survey, that it just was false? And so how did the map maker maintain their reputation?
Yes and no. So I think there's a lot of clueless British officials who think they know something about America but really don't. They're kind of willing to believe this because it's simpler to believe it. But there's a lot of people who looked at maps in the 18th century with special knowledge. They knew that maps like this were of a certain resolution. They couldn't be depended on if you wanted to get the details. And so they were savvy map consumers. And many of the people in Britain knew this as well. In just a moment, I'll show you their solution to this, which was to try to survey a real line through space, which they hoped would do what this abstract line could achieve. So, once again, we see an instance in which Great Britain is putting its faith in maps before they really have the evidence they need to make use of the space. So it's another example of that kind of hubris that they have when they face this problem of empire. So the last part of the story of the proclamation line I want to tell gets to this point. British officials, the smart ones, knew that the proclamation line was really more of an abstraction, an idea. It wasn't a real boundary that you could easily find in real space. So they initiated a dozen-year-long process to negotiate a diplomatic boundary with each of the individual Indian nations. And they even invited Native Americans to help define the course of this boundary. So this is what the boundary looked like in 1768, after most of its segments had been formally negotiated and many of them surveyed between the native nations and Great Britain. You can see it's quite different from the proclamation line. You can see how much of Florida really remains Creek Indian territory, and how the line actually goes a lot more inward than the imagined line at the start. So in 1768, British officials were able to trace a more realistic boundary that started on the banks of the Mississippi River, and it went all the way up to Iroquois country in upstate New York. And I just want to show you one of the hundreds of maps that they generated during this process of diplomatic negotiation over where the boundary would be and where it would be surveyed. So this is a map in South Carolina. The Cherokee Indians met with the British Indian Superintendent in 1765 at a place called Fort Prince George in the Carolina backcountry. There, both sides agreed to a new boundary between South Carolina and the Cherokee Nation across a 50-mile stretch. They agreed that this boundary should pass through a place called Devise's Corner, which I've highlighted here in pink. It was a small trading post on a place called Long Cane Creek. This spot was important because it had witnessed an episode of really notorious recent frontier violence, just a few years before. The Cherokees considered Long Cane Creek, which you can see passing through this map, as the kind of vernacular boundary with South Carolina. But as you can tell, it has a lot of tributaries and creeks extending in every direction. And as settlers started pouring in by the hundreds in the 1750s and 60s, it wasn't really clear whether they were stepping over the line or not. The Cherokees believed that there had been an unwritten understanding of the creek as a boundary, and that every time a settler came close to it or stepped over it, they were violating this understanding. And as a result, a party of young Indian men attacked the settlement at Long Cane Creek in 1760. They killed more than 100 colonists when they did this. So to resolve this recent episode of frontier violence, the British sent out surveyor John Pickens to mark a new boundary that would be clear and visible across this contested space, cutting across all these complicated rivers, creeks, and streams. And in fact, this map is not only a map, it's kind of like a diplomatic contract. In the lower corner, you see there's a whole passage. It basically says, we, the headmen of the Cherokee towns, sign this map to affirm that what the surveyor laid out in real life that we witnessed is the boundary we agreed to. The British knew that the Indians really didn't have a written culture, and that the way to get an affirmation behind this deal with the Indians was to have people witness it and then go back to Cherokee towns and tell other Indian people that the boundary was done properly. And this is a copy. You can see the circles that say LS. On the original, this would have been a place where the Indians would have had a red wax seal. And if you're a colonial governor, you have a silver stamp that you would put on your official correspondence. Native Americans don't have silver seals, so they put their thumbs on it. So the original maps have thumbprints of Indian chiefs. So this is more than just a map, it's also a contract. In 1776, after this map had been drawn, Cherokee travelers found a blazed path that they could actually see. It was marked by posts that were sunk into the ground, by poplars, pines, chestnut trees, black oaks that were blazed and hacked so you could see where the line would run. This idea of this process was not only to create a map that was a legally binding contract between the two sides, but also to find a visible way to mark the landscape so that Native Americans as well as Europeans could understand each settlement, each waterway in relation to the line. What was in South Carolina? What was in Cherokee country? The talks at Fort Prince George had produced this boundary, but there were dozens of these official negotiations that created this big continental boundary line, segment by segment. Britain placed an enormous amount of faith and resources and personnel behind this massive surveying project to create a real boundary across the Indian frontier. But in the end, and we can see how Pickens' maps fits into this larger continental process. British Americans just couldn't tolerate the idea that they didn't have the right to colonize the continent, that they would be restricted and limited by these lines. Their complaints about these limits and about the proclamation line was one of the factors that drove their resistance to British rule and a contributing cause of the evolution. And by imposing some demographic data on this line, we can see that in 1770, the line basically draws the course around where most British people and African slaves were settled within the colonies in 1770. But in 1780, the war was still raging in America, and settlers were crossing this line with abandon. By 1790, this line no longer had any legal validity to bind citizens of the United States of America. It was null and void. And the British made no provision in the Peace Treaty of 1783 that ended the war to assure Native American subjects of the king that they would have any rights in this new republic. So you can see how settlers were pushing across this boundary of 1768 just a generation later.
Are the yellow dots representative of population size?
It is, and on another map like this, it's basically an intensity map, so the darker the color, the more dense. Each of them means a certain thing. I think the yellow ones mean 5 to 10 settlers per square mile,
Right.
and the more dense ones.
Because I know, like, if you look at like in the 1790s and in Tennessee and in 1804 in St. Louis and Chicago, it's surprisingly, it's surprising how few people were there.
Yeah, by our standards, these would not be urban spaces.
Right.
They look like wilderness. But to Native Americans, especially Native Americans who depend on open field agriculture that European cattle can destroy, or hunting deer for the skins that they could sell, even being close to Indian towns and communities disrupted the subsistence and hunting patterns that they needed to survive. So, it's really, 1768 was this moment where there was a hope placed in this line, and it really couldn't do the work it was supposed to do, especially because the war just upended everything. So, if we turn now far to the northeast of North America, British officials had another problem with empire, and it was largely the problem of what to do with the border region called Maine, this sparsely settled province in distant Massachusetts. This was a vast region that possessed a vital strategic resource for empire in great abundance. Britain ruled America because its ships ruled the waves of the Caribbean Sea and the Atlantic Ocean. The great masts of each of these sailing ships had to be constructed from a single tall white pine tree. And there was a huge series of forests off the coast of Maine that had these resources in enormous abundance. So the trees in Maine, the tall white pine trees, were technically off limits to colonists. They were known as the King's Woods, but New England merchants conspired with local landowners to set up illegal sawmills up country in places like the Androscoggin River. And there, according to the official who was supposed to police this vast space, the surveyor of the woods, John Wentworth, many were, quote, cutting and hauling mast or white pine trees out of the King's Woods. Army Captain Samuel Holland was named Britain's Surveyor General for Northern North America. In the war, he'd been a critical advisor for the British campaigns against France. Now he presided over this great cartographic survey of Northern North America, and it was intended to allow Britain to have the knowledge to take control of illegal logging and take control of settlement of all the colonies in the Northeast, including Quebec, Prince Edward Island, and the Maine coast, among other places. And Samuel Holland and his team of surveyors inspected the craggy coastlines of northern New England, and they observed how problematic this issue of tree smuggling and pine smuggling was, because the naval surveyor vessel, it was called the Canso, every time it was alerted that there were illegal smuggling operations going on, it would leave the survey and go try to hunt down those illegal loggers, sometimes seizing their cargoes. So it actually interfered with his ability to persecute the survey. This was such a problem that Samuel Holland believed that Britain would retaliate against the colonists and their smuggling by making Maine a new colony, taking it out of the hands of Massachusetts. And so Holland took this opportunity to define what this new colony what its boundaries would be and what it would be called. He called it, in this map, a sketch of the country between New Hampshire and Nova Scotia, New Ireland. And if you think about the geography of this region, that kind of makes sense. Nova Scotia really means New Scotland. You have New England to the south, so in between you could have New Ireland. And he and his men probably better than any other British official, knew this region because they'd spent years surveying it. And my theory of this map is that it's really kind of a job application. Samuel Holland knew that once his survey was over, he would want to seek other employment in the British Empire, and maybe he would be a good candidate to be the first governor of a place like New Ireland. And his bosses, these powerful earls who ran the government, they actually responded positively to this idea, but the reality was Massachusetts had a lot of lobbying clout in Parliament, and they weren't ready to give up all their landed interests in Maine. So this idea of New Ireland went nowhere. But you can tell the tenor of how Britain wanted to use maps and use geographic knowledge to kind of take land out of the hands of colonists and impose a new order on it. So if we go to this coast of Massachusetts and Maine, the survey started at Cape Ann. Even if Holland couldn't create a new colony along the Maine coast, his surveys worked to open this complex geographic space to new scrutiny by British officials. And here's where we're going to really stretch the Wi-Fi's capabilities to show these super high resolution maps. They created these stunning maps of a notoriously complicated geographic place. This was a coast that was a hydrographic maze. Holland himself described it as an infinite number of islands and numberless harbors and bays. North of Cape Ann, two of his assistant surveyors, James Grant and Thomas Wheeler, pictured the town of Ipswich. It was surrounded by hills that they shaded carefully to give the illusion of three-dimensional form. I'll wait just a second to clarify so you can see. They traced every little course of these shallow creeks along a place they called Plum Island Sound. To the north, other surveyors, up here, pictured Piscataqua at the high resolution of 2,000 feet to the inch. They zoomed in on a growing town in this region called Portsmouth. It showed the layout of streets, networks of roads that extended into the countryside, even the outlines of fences, farmhouses, mills, churches that were scattered along the bayside. If we can't see the high resolution of every map, I'll leave it to you to look at some of these later. Really pretty remarkable. They take a lot of bandwidth to show them. We have this area along the Maine coast where you can see how two of the surveyors who were operating different survey areas, their maps overlapped, and you could see how carefully calibrated this survey was to kind of parcel out the labor so that all these maps could be joined together to create an overarching body of information that Britain could use to control this space. If any of you have been up to this part of the country, you'll know how complex this geography is, all these islands, bays, and what's remarkable about these maps is how well they capture that reality. Geologists study this place that they sometimes call a drowned coast. It's a ragged landscape that was formed about 10,000 years before these surveyors arrived. Retreating glaciers scoured this place pretty thoroughly, and it turned mountains into islands as the oceans rose, and valleys became bays. I'll zoom past that one. Mount Desert Island was a place that was depicted in 3 dimensions. You can see the rugged landscape of Mount Desert Island on these maps. They also went far to the north where there were very few fishermen and settlers at all. You don't see any of the signs of habitation like roads or churches or sawmills up in Passamaquoddy Bay. Holland reported that he had delays in finishing these maps because there was, quote, nothing but a chain of bays, harbors, and inlets interspersed with a multitude of islands everywhere he looked. But he believed that by capturing this space with such resolution, Britain could take firm control over it and promote it. And from what he saw living on the landscape, moving his plane tables from spot to spot was a place that was perfect for agriculture, for commerce, and especially for the lumber industry and fishing. But to take advantage of this place, Britain had to compile all this data together from these separate maps into some kind of unified form that officials could use. So here in the Northern Survey, they stitched all these maps together that I've shown you, and more that no longer exist. And they produced one of the composite maps that really speaks to the heart of this project. This is a kind of, one map to rule them all. I didn't get it. Let's see if we can get it. It might just take a minute to come into place. This map he gave, you'll see in a minute, he gave a grand title to. It's called A Plan of the Seacoast from Cape Elizabeth on the west side of Casco Bay to the St. John River in the Bay of Fundy. I'll keep talking, I hope it's gonna, trust me, it's a great map. This was a map that opened a window into a distant world for officials in London that they could look through and see all of these places in high resolution. And they knew if they were interested in any particular place, there was another map in the Board of Trade's Imperial Archive that would give them an even more detailed picture. So with such a body of information, Samuel Holland and the other surveyors who came to America in the 1760s and 1770s believed they were providing Great Britain with this kind of a perfect overview of British spaces. So I'm going to show you, let's skip over this so we don't have to wait. I'm going to show you two more spaces and then I'll wrap up. So Florida was a place that I think Britain put the most faith in, a place that could be developed into an important plantation colony, but it was a place that the British really knew the least about. There was a surveyor general for the Southern District, just as there was for the Northern District. This was another Army officer named William de Bram. He was ordered to scout the Florida Peninsula for inlets that opened up onto undiscovered rivers. So just to underscore, Britain fought a war and negotiated a peace to bring this new territory into Great Britain, and they had no idea if there were even rivers in it that could support settlement. So William de Bram's job was to identify these rivers and to report on how they could be developed into plantation settlements. So here in southeastern Florida, one of his manuscript maps has survived. And I'm going to switch to a different way of showing these maps so we can actually see. Sounds good. It's cold up there. So here's one of the surviving original charts that de Bram created in order to capture Florida. So in 1765, William de Bram and his assistants boarded a schooner out of St. Augustine called the Augustine Packet to locate these unknown rivers of settlement. And at the time, the best maps of Florida pictured this space as a kind of collection of islands in the southern peninsula. One of the things that Bram was charged to do, that he did in fact do, was to show that Florida wasn't a collection of islands, it was an integral part of the continent. And he did so in these beautiful hand-drawn charts that are at the Library of Congress. He found the rivers to be kind of surprising. Here's the new inlet that he located. Instead of like the other rivers in North America that flowed from the mountains down to the coast, these rivers kind of meandered along the shore just behind the sand dunes and the mangrove swamps. Whenever he found these inlets, he would, or his assistants would take a rowboat into these shallow inlets. But there's a lot he couldn't see from a rowboat with a telescope. There was a lot of blank spaces in these maps. And what he did is you can see all the text on the left-hand side. He filled it up with his observations about navigation. He assessed the soil. You can see it says good corn and indigo land here. he tried to give his superiors not just a geographic document, but a whole assessment of the environment and where plantations could be founded. And here's Biscayne Bay. So from St. Augustine, there was a very aggressive governor, a Scottish colonel named James Grant, and he really wanted to make Florida a success. And he was promoting the closest inlet south of St. Augustine, a place called the Mosquitoes. And he wanted that place to be the center of colonization. So he sent William de Braun to this place, and he ordered him to do a complete map. So here we have a map that's a really high-resolution map of this Mosquitoes district that James Grant had pinned all his homes. He was soliciting people to invest in this land and found plantations. Despite his promotion, and Grant certainly wanted de Braun to put a rubber stamp on his plans for the development of the Mosquitoes district, and de Braun and his team spent 2 whole weeks here showing the depths of the waterways here. He created this special chart of the Mosquito Inlet, as he titled it, and twice the resolution of his other charts, 1 mile to the inch. He sent this chart after 3 weeks of surveying to the Board of Trade in 1765. He included a 13-page report that described the land around it, and he gave a highly negative opinion of its harbor. He said that the sandbars were too dangerous, ships couldn't cross into it, and there was better planting land elsewhere that he had found. This enraged James Grant so much that when they met later, James Grant challenged him. William de Braun held up his commission from the king, and James Grant slapped it out of his hand. James Grant later fired William de Braun, who had to go back to England to clear his name, which did not help the survey proceed very quickly. But William de Braun seems to have been right. The Mosquitoes was not a great place for plantation settlement. And there were spectacular plantation failures for people who took James Grant's advice and settled there. The first major plantation in this district was by a Scottish doctor named Dr. Andrew Turnbull. It was called New Smyrna, and the site of the city of New Smyrna is on this plantation. Turnbull had a theory. He believed that since Florida was in roughly the same parallel as the Mediterranean, the best people to grow crops in this land would be poor Mediterranean peasants who could be brought over and could plant vineyards and grow almonds and all the things that grew so well in the Mediterranean. So he enticed 1,000 of these people to come to Florida as his indentured servants with a lot of promises. They suffered high death rates, especially from malaria, and ultimately by 1777, this Mosquitoes plantation was abandoned. Again, we see Britain had high hopes that mapping could be the key to reveal this valuable plantation landscape in Florida, but it wasn't really prepared to adapt to the realities of the place that it had found with kind of dire consequences. So the final place I want to show you is in the Caribbean. So the British Caribbean was already a very prosperous and repressive place. These islands, like Barbados and the Leeward Islands, places like Antigua and St. Kitts, grew a lot of sugar and made more money for the British Crown than any other colonies in America. And one of the great benefits of the peace was that Britain would take possession of 4 new islands that weren't very well developed: Dominica, Grenada, Tobago, and St. Vincent. The path for these islands was pretty clear in British thinking. These were places for planting sugar, for consuming slaves through the slave trade, and making as much money as quickly as possible. And many British officials believed that by making a success of these plantation colonies in the Caribbean, they could kind of bankroll some of the other colonies in places like Florida and Maine. So the plan was that the Board of Trade would send surveyors to these islands. They would carve up the entire islands into predetermined plantation plots across this landscape and auction them off in London to the highest bidder, so we could generate revenue from this process right from the get-go. And so if we look at the island of Dominica, we'll see that here's one of the published maps that the surveyor for Dominica, a guy named John Byers, published in 1776. And it shows a landscape that was already parceled out into plantation tracts. Each one of these numbered tracts has someone who bid on that in London and paid a lot of money for the privilege. It even had a plan for a model town that was supposed to be called Portsmouth. And you'll see that many model towns in the imperial world had these garden lots outside the town. Savannah had garden lots, other places as well. And the idea there was that even if like a lot of Caribbean islands during wartime, would be cut off from supplies of food from the mainland, and many of the slaves would starve during those war times. If every townsman in Portsmouth had their own garden lot, they could produce enough of their own food to survive. So Britain wasn't only making new plantations, more sugar, they were trying to make a Caribbean plantation more sustainable so that the benefit of these colonies would last. And we have a really interesting collection, these are the last maps I'll show you today, for a little parcel of land that was purchased on the southeastern side of the island on a place called Rosalie Bay. So this is Rosalie Bay from John Byers' perspective. And the owners of these tracts in Rosalie Bay pooled their tracts together and formed the Rosalie Estate Company. It's basically a modern real estate scheme where they developed a showplace plantation at the heart of this complex. You'll see what they did. They built an idealized sugar plantation here that was kind of designed to show off to other investors who could buy undeveloped tracts that would join this real estate enterprise. And so here you have a group of Negro houses, they're labeled on the map. This is the slave quarters for the labor force. An ornamental garden that separated the spaces of white residents and black life. In the Caribbean, slaves died by droves, really being worked to death for their labor to produce sugar. But the partners at Rosalie built a hospital, and they hired a nurse to live there so that sick slaves, the promise was, could be cared for, and maybe there could be a version of plantation slavery that wouldn't have this horrible consequence in terms of mortality. And here we have the harbor with these British schooners at the bottom that show how lucrative all of this business is going to be. The artist Isaac Verdon, who created this overview map that was passed hand to hand in London as new buyers were enticed to invest in this scheme, also provided this watercolor pictorial image of this plantation. And here you can see the sugar houses, really factories in the fields that produced sugar at scale really efficiently. You see in the background the slave quarters. And you can see the line where slaves had stopped cutting down trees, leaving a Caribbean forest in its wake. And you even have these interesting agricultural, architectural touches. Here's a privy house with this interesting steep roof. And down below, the manager's residence has the same architectural style. So this is really meant to be more than just a place of production. It's supposed to be a beautiful, civil, orderly version of a Caribbean plantation. And I think what's most almost poetic about this image is this little image of two figures in the foreground. So what it looks like to me is this is by field 22. This is one of the sugarcane fields. You have a white man, he's wearing a blue coat and a tricorn hat, and a black man, can't really see their faces very well, but he looks to be wearing just undyed breeches. Both of them are carrying these canes, so I don't know what's going on in this image, but it looks like they're just meeting each other in this remote corner of the estate. And although we know that Caribbean plantations could be very violent places, these two people look like they're just talking. They just met each other on the path. So together, I think you get an image of plantation slavery in the Caribbean that was highly distorted. It was an image that promised a potential investor that they could not only grow rich, but by investing in these lands, they could create something beautiful that wouldn't be tarnished by the reputation of the West Indies as a brutal, volatile place. That they could be wealthy, be productive, help the empire, and in doing so, they'd be doing good for everyone. So before I conclude, I just want to show you one more map of this place. So when the partners, it turned out, bought Rosalie Estates sight unseen, and when they actually found out more about the land that they had paid top dollar, so to speak, though they paid pounds sterling, to acquire, they realized that a lot of it wasn't what they were promised. It wasn't fit for cultivation. And so they drew another map that did not circulate widely. It was like the mirror image of that first map that showed how beautiful Rosalie Plantation was. It was a map that was meant as a legal document, and they submitted it to the Board of Trade and the Treasury Department to say, here are all the places on our estate that we can't do anything with. They're impracticable lands that we shouldn't have to pay for. And their enterprise, it turns out, wasn't that prosperous. It looked great on paper, but they were losing money. Slaves had died by the score as they were clearing the plantation in its early years, and they had to find a way to make this enterprise go forward. And one of the ways was to maybe not pay as much for the rent. And so they showed these places that they noted were as much of a third of all the territory were these steep mountainsides, these deep ravines that you couldn't grow any crops on. And they hoped that the treasury would take pity on them and not make them pay for these lands that they couldn't use. So here in this map, we see a kind of mirror image of the idea of Caribbean prosperity. Here was a place that was just too wild, that couldn't be tamed or brought into order. Again, a tension between the representation of this place and the realities underneath it. So in 1763, Great Britain took stock of these territories that they won during the war. They understood that this vast Western empire had to be brought under control, and they tried to bring it under control with hundreds of new maps that were surveyed to represent these little-known spaces that were far from London. These images express the idea that if given direct access to American land, British officials could plan their development much better than colonists could. This idea, this effort to reform America, provoked furious resistance from colonists that culminated in a revolution. Britain mapped these lands to take control of America in new ways. It really pushed colonists aside as the agents who had long taken the lead in colonizing the New World and took pride in that work as an accomplishment. Revolutionaries rejected these British plans for empire that these maps were going to design and put in place. They demanded that American settlers should reclaim the task of colonizing the continent, this time as independent citizens rather than as colonial subjects of a distant king. So they looked at this new map of empire. In 1776, American colonists tore it up and threw it away and started drawing their own maps. Thanks very much.